Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from Quranic.com. Today is Saturday 20th of August 2016 and today the subject is Salat in the Qur'an. This is a question I'm asked about a lot, particularly by traditionalist Muslims or people from a traditionalist Muslim background. If you're not from a traditionalist Muslim background, you may not understand what all the fuss is about. And the reason is, especially if you're from a Christian background, is that such things don't take on quite the same level of emotionality as they do in the traditionalist Islamic world. Christians, for example, pray all kinds of different ways, and they have all kinds of different ideas about things. Whilst Christians often and do differ between themselves, they don't see it as perhaps in quite the same terms as traditionalist Muslims do. I'm talking about prayer here specifically, although I'll explain why Salat doesn't mean prayer specifically as I go through the notes. But I'm using prayer because prayer is, to some extent, what the traditionalist says Salat means. You can go to a Methodist church, you can go to a Catholic church, you can go to an Russian Orthodox church, you can go to the Quakers and see prayer practiced in a range of different ways without it becoming a bone of contention. This isn't the same in the mosque. These sorts of subtleties will not be readily accessible to people not from a traditionalist background, but if you are from a traditionalist background, you'll know that in the mosque you can tell pretty much immediately what someone's religious affiliations are by the way that they stand when they pray, whether they cross their hands over their chest or have their hands down by their sides, whether they pray at the particular times, whether they combine the two prayers in the midday prayer and the afternoon prayer, and this can all get blown out of proportion, and anyway, it all becomes very silly. I'm asked what I think Salah means, and what I'm going to do is read to you the notes from my book, The Qur'an, A Complete Revelation, which you can download in its entirety for free from Quranic.com or buy the hard copy from the same site. Now, I'm just going to read through my notes. I may stop off at some points to expand on some of it, but fundamentally this is Article 3 on Salat from the appendix section of the book. The traditionalist's position, in summary, regarding Salat is that his non-Quranic literature tells him that the value for Salat is equal to X, a certain number of daily rituals, at least 5 but sometimes more, and that since he does not find X in the Qur'an, he, and we, by extension, should understand that the Qur'an requires his non-Quranic literature to be understood or implemented. Now, it may seem strange to one not familiar with such a mindset that any thinking individual could function unimpeded by the contradiction between such a stance on this point on the one hand and acceptance of the Quranic position, which is that the Quran is complete and perfect, on the other. This is a point I make in several articles and in various talks, which is that such doublethink is not the preserve of any one culture or system, religious or otherwise. Western quote-unquote morality abounds with such obvious contradictions. For example, we believe in democracy and human rights, but we're bombing Libya and creating wars in Syria and creating actually ISIS. You have to be able to countenance and to accept doublethink in both systems, be it the traditionalist Islamic system or the pseudo-liberal democratic system. In general, people don't seek truth. What they seek is social confirmation, safety in authority, and absolution from any requirement to think for themselves. Manipulation of this reality is how the intelligent psychopath caste manages the masses, and that's true whether you're in a so-called Islamic background or whether you live in a so-called democratic country. Now, to return to the main subject, one may assume, given the traditionalists' high dudgeon and energetic presentation, that there exists a single statement in his supposedly reliable non-Quranic literature where the form and content of the complete ritual he calls Salat is clearly set out. A quick parenthesis for those who don't have a traditionalist Islamic background. When one says Salat to a traditionalist Muslim, or actually to anyone who's studied Traditionalist Islam, what he understands by this is 5 daily prayers. This is what he will call the prayer, okay? And as we continue through this article, we'll see why that's untenable, certainly on a consistent basis, and also we'll be able to explain what it actually does mean. So one would think that the traditionalist, who gets very worked up about this, has in his non-Quranic literature, in his what he calls sahih, or his supposedly reliable hadith, that there is one hadith which explains how to quote-unquote perform what he thinks is salat. But one would be mistaken. What he's done is he has constructed a ritual out of little pieces carved out of the corpus of the hadith literature and claimed the result to be of divine origin. Nowhere does any single hadith which he claims to be reliable contain a full explanation of the ritual he claims to be the central, if not the defining, characteristic of his religion. This is problematic for the traditionalist. His theology is predicated on the idea that the supposed sources for his stories had superlative memories and were the best Muslims that ever existed. Yet not one of the stories attributed to any one of his sources provides a single instance where one of the best Muslims who ever existed proved capable of doing what any child of only average intelligence and perhaps less than average piety brought up in a traditionalist Muslim household can do today with ease, namely, list the received daily prayers and summarize their exact format. So again, the Qur'an itself nowhere says that the value for Salat is equal to X. The traditionalist assumes a value of X and then attacks those who are skeptical of his claims for not finding his claimed value for X in the Qur'an, a value he himself cannot find within it, nor yet cut of whole cloth within that vast library of external sources which he claims to be canonical. We're men and not children. We're called to use reason and to seek knowledge, not to satisfy ourselves with assumptions, no matter how widespread such assumptions have become, how long they have persisted, or how useful they may be to ruling elites and their religion-touting quislings. Perhaps we can do better than the traditionalist if we ignore him and answer the Quranic imperatives to consider the Quran with care and to use reason. So, we move on to the subject of the treatment of Salat in the Quran. As ever, where there does not exist a clear Quranic definition, as here, our first port of call in our investigations is the established Arabic language. Now, what I'm referring to here is my own methodology, the methodology of hermeneutics which I apply in my work, The Quran, A Complete Revelation, is not predicated on the same system, if you want to call it that, which the traditionalist Muslim uses. What he claims to do is to go to the Quran first, and then if that quote-unquote fails, then he goes to his hadith literature. Then if quote-unquote that fails, then he goes to the fiqh, or the sort of the understanding of various prominent Muslims throughout history, etc. What I do is I accept the Quran's own terms, which is that it is perfect, it is complete, it has everything in it that you need. And I look to it for its definitions and for its, which you can find often actually like dictionary definitions, and where they exist, I use those, and where they don't exist, then my next port of call is the preponderance of usage. So if you read the introduction to my book, I refer to somebody who was a Czech linguist who managed to find the meanings for a then dead language. It happens to be the Hittite language, based on a sort of derivative process, where he derived the meanings of words by looking at their contexts. This was a completely dead language, and he went through the entire texts and decided that the most common word in these texts would be bread, which it was. So now he has a word, and then he built up an entire dictionary, and you can read the Hittite library. You can read this, and he's now got the entire text have been decoded, deciphered by this process of reason. I reasoned that we should be able to do something similar with the Qur'an. Our task is infinitely easier because we know all of the surrounding words, but there are these key words such as Salat, which have been invested with a very particular kind of energy. I don't mean that in a hippie sense, but they've been given a value which jars in many places in the Qur'an. And the traditionalist himself, if you go through and compare traditionalist translations, he ducks and weaves and dodges about what he means about Salat, as we shall see as we progress through the article. So in my methodology, which is the methodology which I've applied consistently through my work, where there does not exist a Quranic definition, as I've just explained, as here in the case of Salat, nowhere in the Qur'an does it say, does it give a clear intimation of what Salat is. The first port of call in our investigations is the established Arabic language and also usage. So the core non-religious dictionary meaning of Salat is that part of the rump or tailbone of a lead horse to which a second horse adheres when following the lead horse closely. Now, this to a modern is somewhat odd because we don't ride horses. It's keeping close to the horse in front, and the Salat actually is that part of the horse to which you would keep close when following a lead horse, something which would be done on a daily basis in any horse-based society, which we haven't been now for 100 years, so it seems a bit strange to us. However, if you were going to take a sort of a car equivalent, it would be following the car in front. Both the traditionalist and I regard this value of the tailbone of a lead horse to which a second horse adheres when following the lead horse closely as historical or vestigial. So we're agreed on that. The traditionalist nowhere says, that's what this means in the Qur'an. This is the historical root sense. But if the traditionalist were to take this meaning as the literal one and then treat it in the way that he does his actual meaning of the word salat, he would have to say something like, the correct way to perform salat is to follow the rump of a lead horse at a distance of exactly 80 centimeters, to be facing in a northeasterly direction, to lead with the right hoof, to be travelling at exactly 20 miles per hour, to be saddled using an Arabian short saddle with the stirrup strapped high, and for the rider to be wearing Arabian garb of the 7th century of the Christian era. Now, while the point I'm making is patently ridiculous, unfortunately it needs to be made given the accretions which have blocked the intellectual arteries of those who have claimed monopoly rights over the Qur'an for so long. And one way to dislodge them is to parody them. Now, a comparable case of that of salat is that of patience. I've touched on this in a previous video, which is called What is Islam? There is no precisely correct way to have patience. One either has patience or one does not have it. And while it is true that in some cases a man may grit his teeth and clench his fists while having patience, that does not mean that the gritting of the teeth or the clenching of the fists define patience in any way, let alone exhaustively. Likewise, there is no precisely correct way of following a horse. One either follows a horse or one does not follow it. Now, I've referred to patience here for a reason. We find it 2:45, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ, and in English, and seek help through patience and salat. Now, since the Qur'an links these words by the same verb, it is reasonable, in fact it is necessary, to assume them to be of the same type. It is not reasonable that a single verb would connect an abstract noun with a concrete one. Now again, I've touched on this in a previous video, but abstract nouns may be joined, hope and fear. Likewise, concrete nouns may be joined, burger and milkshake. However, it's hard to envisage a situation in which a single verb can sensibly treat both fear and burger, because they're made of different conceptual stuff. And since we know, and it is uncontested by the traditionalist, that sabr means patience, or a synonym thereof, and since we know that patience is an abstract noun and not a concrete one, the inescapable implication is that salat is likewise an abstract noun. Now, in a moment I'll get into noun types. If you don't have a linguistic background, this talk about abstract and concrete nouns may be a little bit new to you. However, in a couple of paragraphs we'll cover this. Here we must hold the traditionalist's feet to the fire. He will claim, as evinced by his translations, that salat means prayer, and the unwitting Western reader will assume on that basis prayer to be an abstract noun, but this is because he's been wrong-footed by means of a disingenuous presentation. Of course, prayer can be viewed as an abstract thing, an ephemeral communication of the soul with God, and if that is how we mean it, then it is abstract. But this is not how the traditionalist means the word, at least not all the time. He generally means by it a very precisely prescribed formula of washing, standing, bowing, prostrating, and sitting, in which prayer, in the abstract sense in which we have just used the term, may or may not be present. The second prevalent sense in which the traditionalist uses the word salat is comparable to a specific martial arts kata, if you've ever done martial arts. So that kata is concrete, in which improvement, abstract, may or may not take place. In summary, on this part of this talk, vagueness on the part of the traditionalist translator is assisted by the fact that prayer for the average English speaker is an abstract rather than a concrete concept, and thus translations which use prayer manage to slip a conflation of noun types past the attention of the non-specialist reader. Now I'm going to get into noun types and what they are so that we understand a little better what we're talking about. There are 6 basic ways of describing the character of nouns. There are proper nouns versus common nouns. Now, a proper noun names one specific person, place or thing, Woofy, the dog, or Mount Everest, whereas a common noun names a class or group, dog or mountain. Then you have concrete nouns versus abstract nouns. A concrete noun refers to a material object, a table, a dog, whereas an abstract noun refers to something intangible, love or art. You then have count nouns versus non-count nouns. A count noun identifies something that can be preceded by many or fewer in English and can become plural with the addition of s. Fewer coins, many rivers. A non-count noun designates something that cannot become divisible, such as money, tuberculosis, or happiness. Abstract nouns are often non-count nouns as well, such as honour, or authority, or love. Now, there are many layers of confusion and inconsistency to the traditionalists' understanding and therefore treatment of this noun. And it is as well to begin by identifying the noun type of the value which by default he ascribes to salat, namely a set number of actions performed at particular times. Now, while he does not always capitalize the noun, he still treats it as a proper noun, i.e. the prayer, like Mount Everest in the grammar section above. By the prayer, he means something known and recognized as a discrete thing. And this is why it's confusing to an English person. Well, to be fair, it's confusing to the traditionalist Muslim as well. However, in the English language presented in this particular way, if you're not prepared, if you don't understand what's happening in terms of noun types, it all becomes very vague and fuzzy, and you just basically have to accept that the traditionalist knows what this thing means. But he doesn't, and I will demonstrate why that's the case, at least according to the Qur'an. Because the traditionalist shifts around. He hops from one value for salat to another, depending on what it is he wants to do. What he wants to do, of course, is ram into your brain the idea that his religion is what is referenced in the Qur'an, and all means to that end are fair game. So his default position is that salat means the Islamic ritual, the 5 daily prayers, however practiced. That's what he means. That's what he wants you to take home. That's the takeaway. Salat is that, and that's what most people assume. Most of the letters that I get asking me about salat assume that I'm going to be able to derive from the Quranic text some purely Quranic way of performing this ritual, which they've assumed is the value for salat. However, that's an assumption. This is the assumption of the traditionalist. It's the assumption of most non-traditionalists. They've come to the Quran with an X ready, and they're just looking to attach something to it and say, well, this is how I perform salah, this thing, this specific thing. So in that sense, most what I might call Quranites or Quran alone Muslims have that assumption, not all. And all traditionalist Muslims by definition have the assumption that by default what the word salat in the Quran means is a ritual of some kind. A known ritual of some kind, a ritual of some kind which is specific, and it is therefore a proper noun, the salat. However, when it suits him, the traditionalist Muslim translator also treats salat as prayer as an abstract thing, i.e. an abstract noun, as discussed above, and the English reader of the text doesn't notice because he doesn't really understand the distinction in types. However, it gets much weirder. Where it suits him, the traditionalist translator also renders salat or indicates thereby the Jewish prayer. We have, for example, Zachariah, the Jewish high priest, who's performing salat in the temple at 339. So there it doesn't mean the Muhammadan prayer, it means the Jewish prayer. In another case, it means blessings in the plural form, salawat, at 33:56. And in another case, it means blessings from God towards men. So these are both abstract nouns. And lastly, and most weirdly of all, it means, when it suits him, synagogues. Now, this highly dubious value is required by the traditionalist at 2240 so that he can complete the verse with his dignity intact. Now, this is completely chaotic, and this only becomes obvious or clear if you do what I've done, which is go through the entire text and look at every single instance where salat or the root thereof occurs and compare those contexts, and you realize that what the traditionalist is doing is he's twisting it here, bending it there, twisting it there, but what he's really doing is trying to drive home the idea that, generally speaking, salat is this thing that he has assumed from elsewhere. There is a hadith wherein Muhammad is supposed to be given the prayer, and this is what he's really trying to preserve. I don't care about hadith. I don't come to it with these assumptions and requirements. I'm only interested in what is consistent and tenable and sustainable in the Qur'an on the basis of reason, logic, the Arabic language, and the usage and definitions, if they exist, within the Quranic text, in the text which itself claims to be perfect and understandable. Now, we must, having looked at these different ways that the traditionalist translator twists and bends and squeezes the word salat into various shapes in order to achieve his pre-existing objectives, we must remind ourselves at this point that the Qur'an treats salat together with sabr, and that sabr, i.e. patience, is uncontested by the traditionalist Muslim himself as an abstract noun, like love or hope, those sorts of things. It's an interesting characteristic of abstract nouns that once one knows what they are, one needs no further instructions. To date, no traditionalist has tried to justify to me his preference for non-Quranic sources on the basis of the requirement that to have patience cannot be understood without them. A man knows if he has patience or not. The same holds true for hope or love or fear. Not only are these things for which the Qur'an does not provide exhaustive definitions, they defy any sort of exhaustive definition by virtue of what they are. Since salat is fundamentally of the same stuff as patience, i.e. it is an abstract noun, once identified, it will require no more external information to be comprehended than does sabr or patience. If we accept that salat is an abstract noun, and for me no alternative view has any Quranic justification given the way salat is joined with a provable abstract noun value, it still remains to establish how we can identify salat in the Quranic context, and, if we should achieve a value which seems reasonable, how we can demonstrate that we are correct. To take the second point first, I suggest here what I hold to elsewhere. That is, what is right will fit, and will fit across all contexts. A hand and a glove enjoy a correlation which a foot and the same glove simply do not enjoy, no matter how much one pushes. And what the traditionalist has does not fit. It neither fits in terms of word meaning or in terms of noun type. He is forced to render salat in multiple ways in his translation in order to maintain, or rather to hide, his underlying assumptions. And of course, none of these meanings has anything in common with the non-religious sense of salat as that part of the tailbone of the lead horse to which the following horse adheres. I assert that the correct value will fit all parts. It will be consistent in terms of word meaning. It will be consistent in terms of noun type. And it will bear some relation to the original and prosaic sense of the word salat. Concerning the first point, how to identify correctly the meaning of salat from the Quranic context, we should first recognize the difficulty inherent in any attempt to infer the exact meaning of any abstract noun in circumstances for which the meaning for such a noun is not given. If we use sabr, or patience, as an example, had the meaning of sabr been lost, it would be much more difficult to reconstruct this value with confidence from context than, for example, the meaning of horse, foot, or water, by virtue of the difference in type between abstract and concrete concepts. In our favour, we can count the fact that salat features significantly in the Quranic narrative. The noun occurs 83 times, and the sad, lam, waw root occurs a total of 99 times. It's reasonable to hope that the very incidents of context which reveal the fault lines in the traditionalist claim for salat will also provide a sufficient pool of contexts from which we can derive a reasonable thesis, and having measured that thesis across the entire set, to be sure of our findings if and when our thesis fits all contexts. But where to start? Now, as anyone familiar with the Qur'an in the Arabic will know, the object of our inquiry, Salat, forms part of that frequent Quranic imperative, Aqimu Salat wa atu zakāt. This, I would suggest, is the most significant and visible of all Quranic refrains, and it was with this that I began my investigations. Now, just a quick side note on this, generally rendered by the traditionalist as establish the obligatory prayers and pay the poor tax. Support for an annual tax is nowhere found in the Qur'an, and I discuss zakāt in a different article, which I've also made available as a YouTube presentation, so you're welcome to refer to that. It occurred to me that looking at the verb used with salat here, which is aqama, in other contexts, might shed some light on its meaning, both in combination with salat in this formula, as well as on salat where it occurs with other verbs. Now, the traditionalist claims that aqama means to establish, and synonyms where it occurs with salat. However, the form for verb aqama occurs 54 times, multiple instances of which are not connected with salat, and I looked at them all. And I noticed that the verb aqama takes hudud Allah, the limits of God, as a direct object. And here the traditionalist is forced to render aqama as to keep to observe, to uphold, in the sense of to implement. But this is not what he means by aqama when he talks of salat. The hudud Allah, the limits of God, even by the traditionalist's yardstick, are not mere habit or custom or the execution of a ritual requirement such as he assumes salat to be, but clear directives in the business of life, and are meant to be upheld and implemented as such. As a side note, hudud Allah, the limits of God, are imperatives of a legal nature. See 2.229 and 2.230. The hudud Allah, the limits of God, can be thought of as banks maintaining those rivers upon which the believers may choose their own course. The extremities are out of bounds. Anything which is between those extremities is permissible. What the traditionalist's own rendering means here is to observe, to uphold, to implement, to adhere to the hudud Allah. It means it in the way that one might tell someone to observe traffic laws. So what aqama means in comparable contexts is to adopt a course of action in keeping with well-known criteria. This is the only possible meaning. But this value cannot be applied, properly speaking, to a ritual of any kind. One may make a ritual a habit, one may repeat a ritual, one may do a ritual, but the hudud Allah provide a believer with practical limits which impact his actions and which must be observed. Ritual prayer per se impacts nothing. So to summarize at this juncture, we have seen the Quranic contextual evidence supporting salat as an abstract noun. We have seen that abstract nouns are generally readily understood. We know what have patience means. We do not require substantive instructions on how to have it. We know, because the traditionalist never tires of making the point, that the Qur'an has no instructions regarding salat. But unlike him, we take this to be no more significant than the absence of specific instructions on the subject of patience. We know that the imperative used regarding the hudud Allah, the limits of God, is the verb most commonly used with regard to salat. We know that the hudud Allah denote circumstance-dependent obligations which allow a man latitude within set range of permissible action. On the basis of the above, I began to consider the possibility that the hudud Allah, which require a man to uphold certain principles, and salat might substantively be the same thing, since they share a verb in common, and that while hudud Allah are principles, the details of which are known and should be applied, illustrative of that from which one should stay away, i.e. away from these extremes, the question arose, could salah be characterized by those principles to which one should adhere? So, just to put that in simpler English, the question arose whether hudud Allah would be those extremities, the left and the right bank, from which you should keep away, whereas salat was the line to which you should be as close as you possibly can be. This line of thought brought me back to that etymological base upon which the sad, lam, waw root is formed, and the analogy fits perfectly. A lead horse dictates a particular path dependent upon circumstances, and the second horse stays as close to that first horse as possible. Whatever the lead horse does represents the following horse's duty. The duty of the faithful man, one can justifiably reason, is to please God by believing in Him alone and keeping His commandments. The following horse knows what his duty is by looking to the horse in front. The faithful man knows what his duty is by looking to the commandments of God. I thus had a working thesis. The next step was to test duty as a value across all instances in the text. And it fits in every single case. It fits like a hand in a glove, not a foot in a glove. There are no overlaps or unclear instances. Gone are blessings sent upon a dead prophet, Jewish synagogues, and all the rest of the workarounds to which the traditionalist has had to resort in order to maintain his pre-existing allegiance to a religion found nowhere in the Qur'an. The reading flows and is unproblematic throughout, including in those instances such as 984, 9103, 1187, 1959, 2441, 3343, 3356, 3518 and 5813, where the tension created by the surrounding context is so great that the traditionalist is generally forced to abandon his preferred value in order to complete the verse with a straight face. Importantly, gone also is the need to hop from one noun type to another. My investigations have led me to the conclusion that salat has three connotations. The duty, i.e. in the sense of the general primary duty pertaining to man, duty in general, and specific or context-dependent duty. The three are connected and overlap, but it is as well to understand them. The first use of the word salat occurs at 2 and 3. And here is the present translation. That is the covenant about which there is no doubt, guidance for those of prudent fear, those who believe in the unseen and uphold the duty and spend of what we have provided them. Now, our part of that covenant referred to here is at Al-Fatiha in verse 5. Thee alone will we serve, and from Thee alone will we seek help. This then is the Salat. It is to serve none but God. It is to seek help from Him alone. This is the core of true monotheism and is in no way the exclusive preserve of those who call themselves Muslims. The two remaining connotations of duty are either general, i.e. duty as a concept, or context-specific duty, i.e. indicating a particular duty arising from and implicit in the context. The attempt to turn this abstract noun into something specific and to a proper noun is to apply to the word a quality which the Qur'an itself denies it. So, to summarize, salat has the following connotations. It is our primary duty to God. It is duty as a general concept, i.e., compare hope or patience. And it is a context-dependent duty. In the same way as you can tell when it says God is with the patient, for example. If you look at the context, it's a context requiring patience. Now, That is all Salat means. It means duty. Our primary duty is إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. Thee alone do we serve, and from Thee alone will we seek help. That's our primary duty. We have other duties also, and keeping the duty, or performing one's duty, is all that this means. This may not be as spectacular as you might wish, but I would just repeat, whatever you want to claim for Salat, you must also claim in comparable type for Sabr. Now, if you wish to make Salat specific, i.e. a proper noun, then you must also, to be consistent in the Qur'an, do the same thing for patience. And to date, no traditionalist Muslim has, I'm prepared to be corrected on this, but thus far I have never had a traditionalist Muslim claim to me that there is a particularly correct way of having patience, because we know what patience is. We know if we've got it or not, if we're evincing it or not. Likewise, with our duty to God, we know whether we're keeping it or not. It doesn't require a huge body of literature to explain it to us. Now, the question of worship, I am going to address this because given the pounding that Salat has undergone in more than a millennium, I have to say a few words about it. There are instances in the Qur'an which treat of worship in the context of Salat. Clearly, worship was a duty upon the messenger, and if we choose to follow the messenger, we make worship a duty upon ourselves. For myself, I regard worship as a Salat, as a duty. But it is not more of a duty than my writing or any of the other obligatory activities in which I am engaged. And there is no objectively correct way to perform any duty, so long as it conforms to the general principles of the Qur'an. So there is no absolutely correct way to worship. And to claim that there is one is to ascribe a lie to God, because the Qur'an doesn't say that. Whilst, to sort of unpack this a little bit more, whilst worship is a duty, i.e. so worship is a Salat, not all Salat is worship. This kind of very basic sophistry is the logic of children. It's true that all rain is wet, but it is not true that everything that which is wet is rain. And this is essentially the level of the logic. However, I also go back to my point about patience. This is of the nature of abstract nouns, that they defy the specifics. Is there a correct way to love? Is there a correct way to have hope? Is there a correct way to have patience? No. Is there a correct way to do your duty? No. But you know if you're doing your duty, don't you? Yes. You know if you love, don't you? Yes. You know if you're patient or not, don't you? Yes. This is the nature of abstract nouns, and by virtue of the obvious contexts in which this noun occurs in the Qur'an, to claim it to be a proper noun is to ascribe to it a value and a nature which the Qur'an denies it. Now, I personally am quite comfortable conforming to the preferred form of worship of the traditionalists in the mosques, but I do not see them as binding or exclusively correct. Rather, I see any claim that such and such a method to be the one correct method is anathema to both the spirit and the letter of the Qur'an. Now, a quick side note on that one. I tend not to go to mosques very much because many incorporate a hidden and actually pagan symbology, as much as many Christian churches, although this is not one which is widely understood by the laity. I may do a talk on this at some time, but some of the symbology used in mosques is clearly pagan. It's many of what's called the mihrab, that you have the two pillars there. This is Masonic. The other symbology connected with it, quite frankly, if you know anything about these things, is highly dubious. I have no objection to the Islamic prayer per se, except that I have no preference for any direction, and I don't say Amen after Al-Fatiha, nor do I mention any other name with that of God, nor do I pay any mind to any prophet or greet any angels during the procedure. And I also don't get disproportionately irritated if somebody happens to walk in front of me as I'm praying. But given that it's all but impossible to discuss the Qur'an in the mosque with any degree of intelligence, I personally find it best to stay away. Those things given, I have to say that I find Islamic architecture wonderful. I've always loved it, and when you do find a mosque which is not emblazoned with these subtle images and symbology, which frankly I find offensive, they are, for me, as a personal preference, I find them to be the most natural places of worship, because they're empty of all of the clutter which you find in some Christian churches. So I have a personal aesthetic connection with these places, but I don't believe there is a correct way of praying. Have you prayed? Yes. Well, then you've prayed. I mean, if you look at Musa in the Qur'an, when he's fled from Fir'aun and he's resting by the watering hole, and he turns to God and he says, God, I am in need of whatever good thou hast sent down to me. And that's a prayer. Does it say that he performed wudu and faced in a particular direction? No, it doesn't. He maintained an ongoing dialogue in his mind. Sulaiman, when he's stroking the horses and he's remembering God and asking God not to allow him to become ungrateful for the things that he's given him. We don't see in the Qur'an that particular instances, the sun reached a certain point and then everything stopped and everybody went off. No, we don't see this. Am I saying it's wrong? No. I'm just saying that to say something is obligatory is to ascribe a lie to God. I won't do that. To put it in more prosaic terms, have I got a problem with driving on the left if I'm in England? None at all. In fact, it's a good idea. Or driving on the right if I'm in France? None at all. I accept that those are the conventions of those two countries. But to say that driving on the left is haram, God has forbidden it, only driving in this particular way on the right is the correct way of driving, I won't say that. Why? Because it's nonsense, and it's ascribing to God something which he has not sent down a warrant. My personal view is that to criticize a man for his form of worship is as foolish as criticizing him for driving on the left instead of the right. The question for me is not which side of the road he drives on, but whether he is fulfilling the duty of getting to his destination safely and responsibly in the local context. In closing, Quranically speaking, nothing more sectarian or quote-unquote Islamic can be claimed for Salat than can be claimed for Sabr, or patience. That's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Qur'an free using the button in the top right hand corner, or buy the hardback there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Qur'anite Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. Check my site at skypetalking.com for lessons and more. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. and use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short, eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.